this computer. All right, hopefully this is really recording. Okay, I think we're ready. So George, if you can project out that way, that would be perfect. We don't have video, so we're good. All they'll be seeing are the slides.
Okay.
All right, so thank you all for joining us today. This is the first time we're having a course given by somebody who's in the our interagency R users group, George Zip. Am I saying it right?
Yep.
All right, yay. And George volunteered to give this class and offer it remotely to everybody out there. So thank you so much. We do have some people here at the Bureau of Labor Statistics joining us in person. So thanks for being here in the new year. And hopefully there's going to be more of these to come. We are recording it, and I think we'll be posting this to the Washington Statistical Society YouTube channel, if George gives us the okay. And I guess, I'll let you introduce yourself, say a little bit about yourself, but this is Wendy Martinez, and if you're interested in joining the Interagency R users group, just send an email to me, martinez.wendy@bls.gov. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to pass it along to George.
Hello, I am speaking as instructed, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm the Chief Statistician for the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Transportation. That said, just to back up, this is the Interagency R Users Group session on sample size calculations. As part of my job, I have to do a lot of sample design and sample size calculations. I'll give some examples of the kind of things that we do at a high level, since I'm technically not allowed to talk about it. But our key thing here is PracTools is my go-to package for sample size calculations. Before we begin, I do want to thank Dr. Wendy Martinez of the Bureau of Labor Statistics for making this presentation possible. In addition to her duties as the Director of Mathematical Statistics Research Center, Office of Survey Methods Research, she also chairs the Interagency R Users Group. Dr. Martinez is leading the effort to share our skills and knowledge among federal government staff. This presentation will hopefully be one of many given on specific tasks that can be performed in R. So the genesis behind this and hopefully following presentations is there are many functionalities that we are required to do in the federal government. Sample size is one, sampling is another, mapping, and we're hoping to get ideas from people on things they'd like to see in R. So in addition to any feedback on my presentation skills, what we really want is feedback on future presentation topics that will be useful to the R users community. And if you find it easier just to give me an outstanding for my presentation skills and then focus on the feedback for future presentations, that works with me. And so with that, let's go to the agenda. Page down. Got it. Yep. Nope, I see it. Okay, very good. So today's agenda will include the usual introductions, and then before we begin on PracTools, I will give a short overview of the sample size theory and formulas. It won't take long, but I do think it's important to have some understanding behind the R functions. After that, we will go into the PracTools package and sample size functions. I expect to have time for questions, and as this is an internal group, I would welcome suggestions on what could be done to improve this presentation. And again, please let myself or Dr. Martinez know if there's material that you would be interested in for future presentations. For myself, I'm Chief Statistician, Department of Transportation, Office of Inspector General. As a University of Maryland graduate student in the Joint Program in Survey Methodology program, I graduated with a certificate in survey statistics in 2017. I have to put in a good word for the JPSM. One of my professors there, who I want to introduce here, is Dr. Richard Valiant. He has many titles and many articles. I was fortunate to have him, and I say fortunate because his book, Practical Tools for Designing and Weighting Survey Samples, is very detailed, very thorough, and has many examples in R of survey of practical survey methodology issues that you're likely to face. In addition, he maintains the PracTools package. So it is nice to know the package owner. And on a debt of gratitude, Professor Valiant was kind enough to review this presentation and approve the version you're hearing today. So any mistakes are mine, but that's who maintains the PracTools package. I am not paid to advertise, but this is the book. I highly recommend it. And with that, let's begin the practical part of the presentation. So the first question, of course, is why sample at all? And the issue is, of course, is that the census is expensive. And so sampling saves time and money. You can still get some reasonable precision, but that's why we sample. And sample size calculations are where you start getting into how the survey designer defines reasonable precision. Again, the key thing here from a project standpoint is you, the survey practitioner, decide what reasonable precision is. You know, so for a simple random sample, or SRS for its abbreviation, we'll get into the formula here. And the variance formula, as many of you may remember from statistics classes, the variance of the mean of y is 1 minus the sample size over the population size times the variance of y divided by the sample size. And so far, so good. If we want to solve for n, little n that is, the sample size, we are essentially rewriting this formula. And what this works out to is the sample size is n naught over 1 plus n naught over population size, where n naught is basically the coefficient of variation that you have for the population over the desired coefficient of variation. And it really gets more complicated from here. This is as straightforward a calculation as it is for sample size. And that's really why we use PracTools. We have a tool here that will help you out with this and more complicated sample sizes. So for a sample size, you need the following. You need the population size. You need the alpha you want for either your type 1 error or your confidence interval. You need the variance or the coefficient of variation. You need a sample unit cost if these vary, and you want to optimize your sample size to a cost constraint. And if you're doing power calculations, you need beta, which is essentially the power level. Beta is typically 0.2. The alpha is typically 0.05 or 0.1. But the key thing here, though, is you get to set them. And this slide really is a variation of the previous slide. I'm just turning it around into you, the researcher, are setting what's acceptable. So how large a standard error of the estimate is acceptable? If you're setting a coefficient of variation, again, what's acceptable? How precise of a margin of error do you want to have? How much can you afford? If you are doing power, the probability of detectable difference, how much power do you need? Sample size calculations should be a function of and support to the analytic requirements. For some government data collection surveys, NHANES, for example, the sample size constraints based on coefficient of variation are stated in a publicly available document. So PracTools is the name of the package. If you want to follow along in R in background, I'll give a minute to install packages, PracTools, and then you can call it. This presentation will not go back and forth between R and the presentation. I've copied the code and the output, but I'll give everybody a minute who wants to install it to do so.
I wasn't, but it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those of you who are remote have an advantage in that we're having some trouble with the wireless here. So in addition to saving your travel time, you can install PracTools, although we miss seeing you. So I'm going to assume that people have had a chance to install it. and call it up. And I put together an overview of the sample size functions that are available on Practical Tools. These are all for simple random sample designs and various permutations thereof. So for continuous variables, if you're going to base your sample size on a continuous variable, there's the two PracTools functions, ncont and ncont MOE, that will help you here. If you're interested in proportions, your two functions are nprop and nprop MOE, for Strata. I've included the power tests here. Those do not actually come with PracTools. They come with the stats package. But again, this is a presentation on sample size calculations, and we're trying to teach how to do things from a functional standpoint. So while we're pushing R here, it's not specific to PracTools. And then a two-stage calculation. If we have time, we'll go into that too. That's kind of fun. Yes, we have a question.
Can you tell me what MOE is? Just
MOE stands for margin of error.
Oh, okay.
So.
I'm glad I asked.
Can I have a question?
Yes.
Just before we get too deep into this, because this is very interesting for me. When you're looking at the power so when you're looking at the power calculation, you're usually you are looking to test to test a hypothesis or test something. You have
Right.
two means and you're looking right with a lot of the survey sampling. You're not necessarily comparing anything. You are trying to get an accurate representation of the whole, right? So how does the philosophy of statistical power play there? Because I think it's more, what you're more interested in is what is the theoretical possible distribution of all the means given the result that you get from your sample, rather than, right?
Yeah, so the question is, in a survey context, since a survey will typically ask many questions, when would power be required for sample size? And again, it's a function of the analytic requirements. For a broad data collection survey, I don't personally know when you would use power a whole lot. I certainly welcome the input of other data collection statisticians on the call. But for what we do, actually, where we're looking at something very specific, and we're doing a survey to test, maybe on improper payments, that's pretty measurable. So again, these are functions of the analytic objectives, and while this is beyond the scope of just functions on sample size, I'm of the opinion, start with your analytic objectives and define everything down from there. Your sample size calculations should flow out of your analytic objectives. So if you have just one variable that you're interested in and you need to survey on that and find detectable differences, then how would you approach that with power calculations, and then what tools would you use? So I should have mentioned questions earlier, but if you have questions, probably the best thing to do is turn your phone off mute, speak up, and I will answer your question as best I can. But we have till 12:30, I believe. So we have till 12:30. We have time. I don't know that we'll take all of the time, so ask plenty of questions, please. So I'm going to walk through each of these individually, each function, and in doing so, that'll give an opportunity to illustrate different types of problems you may have. So this isn't quite the question you were asking, but it's close to. Let's say you are the most basic sample size calculation is based on simple random sample for a continuous variable. That's why I started here. This is really one of the easier ones. And just as an example, you are the primary researcher on a survey about business behavior. While there are many variables of interest, contract amount is a key one. Let's assume that for a population, the average contract is $200,000 and the variance is 980, I guess that's billion. what you see underneath in blue is the R function. You won't necessarily need to use all the terms in it, but I want to walk through this. Everybody is familiar with the basic function, that you've got the function parentheses and then parameters within that. In PracTools, the 0 at the end of a parameter indicates something the researcher sets. So in this example, CV0 would be the coefficient of variation that a researcher sets. The desired V0 is the desired variance, and that's what a researcher sets. S2, Y bar U, and CV pop are from the population values, and capital N, of course, is the population size. Just as a reminder, R is case sensitive, and so the capital N indicates population. Before we continue, does that make sense to everybody? I don't know if I can get at a chat here or not. So looking at this formula then, let's say we want to set our coefficient of variation at 0.3, meaning that the standard deviation divided by the mean is 0.3, that your standard deviation is within 30% of your mean, and that you're using the variance and mean from the from a population where you have that. You will see that your sample size is 273. You could have set this up as a CV population, and one of the things that is a neat feature of the PracTools package for sample size is that there are frequently numerous ways to get the same result. So if you're the analytic researcher, you can work with variance, you can work with mean, you can work with coefficient of variations. There's some advantage to coefficient of variation in that, in a practical sense, the variance may be hard to come by. The variances are frequently used from previous surveys or from just additional information you may have. When I was doing research for this presentation, Leslie Kish in his textbook Survey Sampling recommended setting a CV because this is less variable than a variance. Again, as a reminder, population size matters. The finite population correction factor can make a big difference. The default on this function and all sample size functions in PracTools is infinity for n. So if you do not specify the population, it assumes effectively infinity. In this case, I've highlighted in red on the presentation, n equals 5,000, and that in this scenario, the sample size goes down by 14, which may help your budget. So now let's look at, let's add, if you will, the margin of error. And so now let's say you need to be able to bound the margin of error. So you can say things like, this is the population value within 5% of the sample estimate. So expanding on the previous example, we're going to use the function ncont MOE. That's n is sample size, cont is continuous, MOE is margin of error. And in this case, there are now some new parameters, MOE.SW, which stands for margin of error switch, and E, which will be your margin of error level. So the MOE switch gives you some choice. You can have a confidence interval based, which is the half-width of the variance of the mean, and this requires the variance, or you can have a confidence interval based on the coefficient of variation, which requires that you either have the population coefficient of variation or the variance and the mean. And E is the desired margin of error in percentage terms. And again, you can set these things up a number of ways. In the first example here, mid-slide, I've got ncont margin of error. The switch is the first switch where we're doing half-width on the variance of the mean. We're saying make it 20,000. And we've got our variance, and we've got our confidence interval, the alpha 0.05. I do the same thing again at 50,000. If I use the switch equals 2, where I'm doing the half-width on the coefficient of variation, remember that the mean y bar u is 200,000, 10% of that would be 20,000. And with the switch, you're getting the same sample sizes. So again, multiple ways of approaching this problem. One of the things I like about PracTools is that you can think about your problem in different terms. That said, the price of that flexibility is, be careful on the switches. The help, of course, is available online and on the internet and in this presentation. But just, keep in mind which switch you like. I have my default favorites. You may have yours, but the key point here is you get to choose and just, you have the flexibility. So be careful with it. Let's look at sample size for proportions. And there are actually two proportions variables. This is a variation of n-cont and n-cont MOE. So n is the sample size, prop is for proportion. Below that you have n prop and margin of error. Couple of things here. I'm going to step back from PracTools and get into sample size calculation formulas. It's worth remembering that the variance of a proportion is maximized at the value 0.5. So PU, which the uppercase U is for universe here. When you set PU at 0.5, you're giving yourself the maximum sample size, assuming you're doing your sample size based on variance. If you do it on CV, then you're looking at the CV of a proportion is the square root of PQ divided by P, which is the square root of Q. And this can have some sample size limitations or implications, I mean to say. So, alternately, the variance can be bound. You can, if you set the variance at 0.0025, you'll get the same sample size at 0.9 as 0.1 for variance. So this is frequently used in my world, the audit world. We're frequently looking at compliance, non-compliance, and what is the least risk. So for us, this is very go-to, and we'll return to that.
So the last parameter is the assumption of infinite population.
Yes, these all assume infinite population in this example.
Do you have a sort of a rule of thumb where you would violate something by that assumption?
I don't know that there's a rule of thumb if you don't know the population. Choosing an infinite sample size is the most conservative sample sizes, a population size. Choosing a infinite population size is the most conservative sample size assumption.
I see.
Because that makes your finite population correction factors effectively 1. If you have a very small population, your finite population correction factor is less than 1,
right,
which will reduce the requirements of sample size.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the MOE.SW?
That is the margin of error switch, and that has to do when I'm going to go back a slide. So the question is, what was the MOE.SW parameter setting? And I'm going to go back a slide, and you'll see the same thing here. MOE.SW is basically, it's a switch. It's a function switch. For 1 is the confidence interval on the half width of the variance of the mean, and 2 is half width on the coefficient of variation.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
So, no, that's all right. So I'm going to continue with this this example a bit. N prop MO, as I call it, N prop MOE, is frequently what people think should be the sample size calculation. When people come to you with a sample size, that, in my experience, this is kind of what they have in their head. The formulas in Cochrane Sampling Techniques, 3rd edition, section 4.4, page 76, we actually refer to that in our published output, because again, if you're looking to survey something with a binary result, a proportion is what you're interested in, and for many of the surveys we do, we actually are looking for things with binary results. You could be trying to survey something where you're looking at a sense of prevalence or, pro or con or opinions or something. But that's, in my experience, in my current job a lot. I'd be curious to if other people have different experiences, because you know, there's a lot here, and OIG is a world of audits, not data collection. So I'm going to walk through some examples, though, just for fun. Looking over my notes here, but I think we'll just cover this. I'll take the first one because this is very typical. So nprop mo, and you've got your first switch, your switch equals 1, where basically I'm doing a confidence on the half width of the variance, and I want it within basically 10% of that the sample will be within 10% of the true value at a 10% confidence level, and I'm setting my population estimate at 0.5. And you can calculate this using Cochrane on your own, or you can just use nprop-mo. You'll come up with 67.6 or 67 as your rather 68 is your standard sample size at a 10% margin of error, 10% confidence level. If you adjust this up, if you change the alpha to 0.05, or you know, say we want to be 95% confident, you go from 68 to 96. And if you want a 5% tolerance level, you go up to 384. So looking at these, you can really get a sense of how sample size changes. I wanted to include this example because the more precision you want and the more confidence you want, these essentially non-linearly increase the sample size. Yes?
So is it safe to say that if you have the PU equals 0.5, that would be the most conservative also?
Yes. So the question is, what is the most conservative setting for your population frequency? And the most conservative setting is 0.5. So variance is P times Q. If you set your P at 0.5, 0.5 times 0.5 is 0.25 for your variance, whereas if it was 0.9, 0.9 times 0.1 is 0.09, which is a lot less than the 0.25. And since your sample size is a function of your variance, to get the same precision with a wider variance, you need more sample size.
So do you sometimes get a pile of data on the variance, or you just are you coming in with an assumption?
In my work, so the question is, what assumptions are we coming in with, and what data do we have to support them? And
mostly in terms of the population variance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The issue is, the way I would frame the question is, if you have pre-existing information and you can defend it for your analytic purposes, use it. You know, so for example, I was on an audit where there were 2 stages, and in the first stage, I assumed 0.5 because we had no information, and that was the largest sample size. And once they were done with the first stage, we had new information, and I could say, based on this new information, I'm going to use, you know, what is, you know, truthfully a more favorable to us sample size based on this new information. So as long as you can defend it, that's I think the analytic issue. So 0.5 is the most conservative for sample size where you're looking at a proportion. But if you can choose something other than 0.5, your sample size drops. You just need to be able to defend it from somebody saying, why didn't you go with the most conservative assumption? So one of the, in the Office of Inspector General, one of the things that's been impressed on me on the last year is just defend every assumption. Write it down. What is your defense? As long as you can defend it, great. But if you can't, go with the most conservative approach that we can afford. Okay. So I'm going to go now to Strata because, again, in practice, the Strata is frequently of interest. And the function here is called stralloc for Strata Allocation. And there are a lot more parameters to look at. And the choice for the sample size will be constrained by an overall N, a cost, or a precision requirement. So that's something to keep in mind if you're doing Strata. Can you know, what is your maximum N, what is your maximum cost? And this function will allow you to take into account all of that. So we're going to talk about this here, but a couple of things is where you see the lowercase h, that is the strata. So going across, you have capital N, lowercase h is your strata population values. Capital S, lowercase h is your strata variances. And the lowercase c, lowercase h is the cost of sampling a unit in that strata. And then allocate, the alloc equals, it must be either proportional, Neyman total cost, or total variance. Okay, here's where things get a little more complicated, and is that we've moved from individual inputs to vector inputs. And again, with anything in R, getting the dimensions right is always, you'll be quickly reminded if they're not right. So this is an example that I've used. It's actually examples from the documentation, and that you'll need different things for different allocations. I'm going to go into that. But let's just say for your strata population sizes, you have 6 strata, and they have 215, 65, 250, 250, 149, and 144 members in each. I've got the variance for each of the strata, actually technically speaking the standard deviation, and then I have the strata unit cost for sampling. So again, with stratified sample sizing, you can take costs and strata information into account. For proportional allocation, that's trivial. You're getting your sample size and distributing it proportionally over the strata size, strata population size. These are allocating to cost or variance. So here are the results for a Neyman allocation. We've put in the total sample size we want of 100, and we've got our vectors for the population strata size, the strata population sizes, and the strata standard deviations. And here is the output. It gives you your inputs, but then for your sample sizes in each strata, will round up 35, 5, 11, 4, 9, and 39. If you need to constrain it to something, you can, you know, if it must be 100, you can decide to round up or down. And you also have the sampling fraction within each strata. So we sample around 35% of the the total sample size. The first strata is about 35%. Only 4% of the next strata makes the total sample. And it gives an anticipated standard error of the estimated mean. So output for the other allocation types is similar. I find that it's useful to take the output here and feed it into other programs or other output. So again, we're getting a little off topic from the sample sizes, but keep in mind that this output, you know, is a list. You can pull the NH function, NH lowercase n, lowercase h out of it and feed that into something else. It has all the functionality of R that you would want here. Okay. Sample size using power calculations. This is not in PracTools, but I thought it was important to cover for an R sample size presentation. And there are two functions here, and one is power t-test, and the other is power prop test. And t is based on continuous variables, and prop, of course, is proportions. So if you're, what is required, of course, is a detectable difference level that you are interested in a power of obtaining a significant result when the true difference is the delta. The significance level, of course, remains alpha. power is 1 minus beta, typically. And this is actually part of the R stats package. So exactly one of the parameters, n, delta, power, standard deviation, or significance level, must be passed as null. And that parameter is determined from the others. So typically, since you're trying to get what the sample size is, n is the parameter you don't pass. This is a very simple example. Standard deviation equals 1. Significance level is alpha equals 0.05. Power is 0.8, where beta was 0.2. 1 minus beta is 0.8. Our delta is 0.1, so we want to see a 0.1 difference. The alternative is two-sided, and the type is two-sample. I'm not quite sure when you'd use a one-sample. Two-sided, of course, is a two-sided t-test. And your calculations are, n in this case is 1571. It gives all the information you provided. A key thing here is that n is the number in each group. So keep in mind you're comparing across two populations. And so each group has to have a population of 1571. So hopefully in a survey, that's doable. So in this case, you would have a 3,142 sample total. I'm sorry? Yes?
I was going to make a statement, but it seems a bit, I don't know how to say it, prone to error that you only have to, that you have to have one of the inputs to that null.
Well,
I know that's the way they wrote it, but it just seems that it could cause errors if people don't understand.
yeah, actually, so the question is, in the design of it, is it prone to error? Is it prone to user error?
Yeah, user error. Thank you. That's it.
And the answer is this was a fun presentation for me to put together, because the more I got into it, the more I realized just how complicated these formulas are, and how, if you will, delicately balanced. You're usually solving for just one variable on several others that are your choice. So in this presentation, the default is to find out what n is, because that's the sample size calculation. But if you were to start, we can afford 100. What kind of delta can we get for 100? You can turn it around. So it's basically, what are your trade-offs? And you can take all the output from here and create a for loop, get lots of output at different levels, make very nice graphs, and decide where on the chart you want to be. So you
would just replace one of them with n, right? If
Yeah.
you wanted to know the power, you replace the power with n equals whatever.
So in this case, if I put in n equals 1571, I haven't done this, so maybe somebody can confirm this for me, and take out the delta equals 0.1 and just run it, see if you get delta equals 0.1. If you don't, try 13.
So I replace the power with the n.
Okay.
I get the same. I get basically I get delta 0.1 power 0.8.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes.
Should there be a double quote after 2 not sample?
There should actually. That is an error in the present. So the question is, should there be double quotes after 2 dot sample? And the answer is yes, there should. And that one got by me. I'm not quite sure how I copied and pasted it. One of the issues I had copying and pasting, by the way, is that the fonts from R to PowerPoint can get a little squirrely, and I had to reformat them on numerous occasions. So, but that is a typo. It should be open double quotes, 2 dot sample, double quotes.
Yeah, I've run into that same problem with the format.
Okay, we have a similar thing here for a power prop test. Exactly, one of the parameters, N, P1, P2, power and significant level, must be passed as null, and that parameter is determined from the other. One of the interesting things about the power prop test is that sample size can be a function of relative risk. So that's a neat thing to keep in mind. The function doesn't strictly call that out, but P2 times the relative risk minus 1 will give you a function of sample size. So the relative risk is P1 divided by P2. So let's say you were looking to measure a relative risk of 2, and you would want that in your sample size. Then P1 is twice P2. P2 would simply be half of P1 in the function here. And you could even, I suppose, just using the power of R, have P1 and then P2 equals 0.5 times P1. Put that in the function directly. But that is a neat function of this, that you can get a relative risk. I haven't used this personally in my work, but I did want to, for people who need to get at relative risk in their survey sample design, this is how you would go about doing it.
What is the actual test here? The statistical test behind this?
Well, the statistical test is really it's not a statistical. So the question is there a statistical test behind this, and if so, what? And I would turn that around and saying, you're the survey researcher, you're the analyst, so what are your acceptable levels of risk? So we've set it at significance level, alpha equals 0.05, beta equals 0.2, and here are your two proportions. What sample size do you need to, determine a detectable difference here? If you've got a relative risk that you're looking to test, your P2 is a function of P1, and your sample size would be driven off that according to these constraints.
But the previous one had a t-test behind it, right?
Yeah, the t-test is behind that. This uses basically the same type of theoretical behind it. Ultimately you're converting things to normal distributions and getting your means and your variances, and making sure that your probabilities are such that your sample size can detect the difference. So the theory behind power test, the question is, what is the theoretical basis behind power tests? And the answer is really you're converting your variables in a power test where you have two normal distributions that can be compared to each other via z-scores, and that will drive your sample size to get the statistical criteria you want to be able to say yay or nay, null or alternative on your hypothesis. Okay. Any questions from the audience?
Should we look at the chat?
Yeah,
I was hoping I could monitor the chat, but.
we're going to take a quick 2 seconds to look at the chat to see if people have questions. And after that, I'll go on to two-stage sampling.
It's good. I think people can hear. But will the slides be available? Yes, right?
Yes, we will make the slides available.
Yes, the slides will probably be posted on the Washington Statistical Society website. You could email me if you can't find it, or if you want me to email them. Okay. Any questions on what's been covered so far? If you could send it on the chat. Okay, good. Well, we'll come back to the chat. You could always put them in there and we'll come back and look.
Okay. Okay, that works too. So two-stage sampling. Two-stage sampling is where things begin to get more difficult because there are a lot more parameters to account for. And in practical terms, if you're doing two-stage sampling, cost is very likely to be an issue. And while beyond the scope of this presentation, determining, homogeneity within a PSU and the between PSU variance versus the within PSU variance, that really gets at a lot of theory that I can address in questions, but that are outside the scope of this presentation. But this is also sort of where it gets interesting too. We use some two-stage sampling, but in our case, we don't use it in the way the data collection agencies use two-stage, three-stage, et cetera. As I recall, there are three-stage sampling functions in PracTools, but we're going to stop at two-stage. So looking at this, it's CLUS opt2, and that stands, I believe, for cluster optimization two-stage, thinking of PSUs as clusters. And what you will need is C1 and C2. These are cost functions, and your total cost. You will need a target CV overall. You will need some measure for delta between 0 and 1, which is homogeneity. Delta is defined as the between PSU variance divided by the between PSU variance plus the within PSU variance. So it really gets into how homogeneous your PSUs are. The K is ratio of between to within unit rel variance. And you also have a switch again for a fixed total budget or a target overall coefficient of variation. Delta is, if you set that will affect how sample is optimized over PSUs and SSUs. But again, you're looking to target precision or a budget constraint, one of those two. And so here's an example I picked. It's a fairly easy one. We had, to go to a PSU costs $750. To sample an item within a PSU costs $100. We have a delta of 0.5, and that's, as we'll see that, hang on a second. I wish I'd had a second example, but didn't. And in this result, where we've got things set up as, the unit rel variance equals 1 and K equals 1, our cost is our cost. We will have 51.4 primary sampling units and 11.9 secondary sampling units. If I had changed the delta, that will affect the distribution. So as delta goes from 0 to 1, the distribution of sampling units shifts from fewer SSUs to more PSUs. I think I worded that right. I mean, basically, if your PSUs are very similar, you'll need more PSUs. If they're very heterogeneous within a PSU, you need fewer of them.
So M is the number at the first stage?
Correct. M is the number of PSUs, and N is the number of SSUs. Yeah. So I'll just for two-stage, I'll repeat what I wrote down in my notes, but it is a mouthful of a sentence. As delta goes from 0 to 1, the distribution of sampling units shifts from more to fewer SSUs and fewer to more PSUs. So as delta approaches 1, you'll have more PSUs, fewer SSUs. As delta approaches 0, you'll have more SSUs and fewer PSUs. But again, it's actually very interesting to look at the homogeneity of a PSU and getting information on that. Again, while outside the scope of this presentation, getting information on PSU heterogeneity is really, really critical to the success of your survey, regardless of sample size, in my opinion.
Yeah, would you need to kind of write a for loop and just graph
Yeah.
how those are related?
Yeah, it is. It's kind of fun, and it is just you really get a good, clear sense of, how powerful, homogeneity really is when you start playing around with this. Okay. So in conclusion, last slide here, we've covered our PracTools functions for sample size calculations. That was the scope of this presentation, to how to use R for sample size calculations. And for single stage designs, the results of these functions are pretty straightforward. One thing I did not discuss is design effect, and if design effect is an issue, remember to multiply the calculated sample size by the design effect for the survey sample size. So if your sample size is 100 and your design effect is 1.5, you want your sample size to be 150. 100 times 1.5. Multi-stage designs are more complicated, but our PracTools does have functions to address these issues. And if you get into it, there's a lot of functionality to go into 2-stage and 3-stage survey designs. It really is meant to set things up so that you are, in a practical sense, of being a survey practitioner, emphasis on practice, setting things up so that when your survey is done, you can get you will meet your analytic objectives. And it is always a good idea to discuss survey design with other statisticians. I personally enjoy it, so to me that's fun. And again, I'm hoping that this will be the start of many presentations on specific topics in R and how you can use R to do more and more of your job. We're using R more where I am. Other people are the same. The interagency R users group seems to be growing. And please send any topics to martinez.wendy@bls.gov. And with that, I will turn it over for questions. Well, thank you.
I think I had a question, but I forgot about
How do I do chat? Let's check for chat, and then I'll get to your question.
I wish I could remember. I was a good question too. I had. Let's see. What? Oh, okay. Well, that was weird.
We didn't want that.
Oh, we don't want this. What? Oh, don't save. Okay, let me just reduce it here. Oh, Zoom must be here. Controls. Oh, there we go. Okay, chat. Okay, nothing on the chat.
Okay. There are no questions on the chat room, but we do have the chat up and can respond to questions. We have a question here.
Do you have any thoughts? And it's probably not an issue in this type of survey sampling, but sometimes when you design clinical trials, you want to know. I mean, if you continue in a clinical trial after you have reached your objective, it becomes an ethical issue because you have to start treating people rather than doing research on them. Do you have any thoughts on any kind of adaptive design where you would, as you go, you would, let's say, follow and see if your assumption was correct and adjust your assumption about, let's say, the variance as you go?
Okay. So
is that even legal? I'm not sure.
So the question is on, what if your survey has ethics implications and also just various practical dealing with the survey subjects? This presentation is restricting itself to just the math formulas. So if you have ethics considerations or long-term cost you could include long-term cost considerations into this. So if up front you were to say, we think that the overall cost will be this and we need to adjust for that, you could take that into account. If the cost is the same for any survey participant, of course the cost comes to a wash. So you don't need to take into account there. But if some survey participants were more expensive to follow up with than others, you could include the costs. Regarding the ethics, ethics trumps math, so, or at least it should.
Yeah. I was going to, I don't know if this is relevant, but there has been some work done with adaptive design in the survey world. It's been several years, right?
Yeah.
That people have looked at it. I don't know if that's exactly relevant to, I think what you're saying about, maybe once you reach the limit on how many patients, then do you quit or not?
In
But
clinical trials design, it's kind of an established thing. But I was just wondering with what you guys do you reach that?
Let me take a variation of this. So the question is on adaptive design and sample sizing. And in my experience, adaptive design has been implemented when you have non-response issues. And so you're trying to adjust, to increase your sample size on the fly to compensate for the fact that you're not getting the original sample you wanted. That's my experience. I'm sure it's adaptive design is broader than that. What we did not discuss here is all the reasons why you might want to increase your sample size beyond your initial estimate. So let's say your sample size is 100 based on the math alone. And then you do an analysis of your sampling design and decide that your design effect is 1.5. So we'll multiply that. Now we're at 150. So 100 times 1.5. Now let's say we expect a 50% response rate and we must have the sample size that we need to meet our analytic objectives. Now we have to double the sample size just to get, the 50% responders. So we've gone from 150 to 300. Now let's say we have coverage issues and that we're not, so in addition to non-response, we may have to do some other on-the-fly adjustment. And let's say that's going to cost us 20%. 20% of the 300 we're at is 60. So now we're at, 360. So it can add up quickly when you do these things. But again, I'm only familiar with adaptive design as a non-response adjustment. As an aside, BLS, and there are numerous topics on this, and I went to a seminar on adaptive design here about 2 years ago. There's a lot of really good work on it.
I remembered my question.
Oh, okay.
So many of the surveys done by the principal federal statistical agencies, they tend to be long-established surveys. So we often don't get a chance to, start off and design our surveys. So in your office, do you get to do this often?
So actually, I have a very good job because I am the internal consultant, if you will, and we do start to finish. So we are not a data collection organization. We are basically required. We're a part of the the Inspector General Act of 1976 or whatever it is, where all agencies are required to have one, and then we help save money by using surveys.
Okay.
So, but we in my role, I'm start to finish, help frame the objectives, determine sample sizes, pull the sample, analysis, everything.
Wow. That's actually kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Because you get to do all of it. All right. Well, we don't have any questions online. So any more questions in here from the audience?
Okay, well, then I want to close with thank you very much for your attendance. I hope this was helpful to you. And I would love to have feedback on anything we could do to improve and whether this was a good format. And I'm hoping that we can do more of these. This was actually a lot of fun for me to do. So I want to thank the audience and for the many people who attended. So I appreciate that.
Okay, well, thanks. Let's thank George again.
Very helpful.
All right, everybody, we're going to shut it down and thank you for joining us remotely. Oops, I guess I should do this here.
Before you shut it down,
Yeah, let's see.
okay, so you have managed participants. So we're all
Yeah.
dropping off.
Yeah.
See if there's anybody who we know. No, I guess a lot of people like last name. That's
There's me.
okay. All right, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, okay, I'm going to stop
I was
sharing.
wondering if are you guys? I'm losing the overview because I don't see the